city ideals and the everyday urbanism in an informalizing city. We're focusing on particularly on the city of Harare, which is the capital of Zimbabwe in Southern Africa. So when Simba invited me to give a talk in this seminar series, I thought, what exactly can I share that can resonate with different people from different disciplines? And I think if you are from geography, sociology, and any other discipline within the social sciences, you understand that globally, cities are competing for capital. Cities are competing to be economically competitive and attractive to tourism. And one of the ways through which cities do that is kind of branding themselves as world-class city. And I'm going to talk about that briefly. But this is not just an issue that is peculiar to Harare alone, but even in most global south cities, including in Asia, in Latin America, and even other African cities like Lagos, Johannesburg, Nairobi, they've come up with these, grand visions of becoming world class. But the key question for today is, looking at those, how exactly do urban practitioners conceptualize a world-class city, and how does that relate to everyday urbanism, or the realities of urban development in those particular cities? What are the implications, social, economic, and spatial implications for urban planning and policy? So for the next 30, 40 minutes or so, I'll introduce the topic, then briefly talk about a conceptualization of informality, and then I will share with you, I think someone is...
Sorry, Elmont, let me... Yeah, sorry about that. I've muted the participant.
Okay, that's fine. So then I'll share with you these theoretical perspectives on worlding cities from the global south. Positioning my talk within this framework of worlding. What exactly does it mean? What are the different dimensions of worlding? Then I'll introduce the case study of Harare in terms of its history, its social, economic, and spatial characteristics. Then I will briefly talk about the methodology of my study, then the key findings, and then the key takeaways, and then I'll end with some concluding remarks and reflections for the future. This project is part of a large-scale research agenda on urban governance and the spatial politics of informality in African cities. And for today, I'm specifically focusing on Harare, but I will reflect more, in a more broad perspective in terms of how does what is happening in Harare relate with other, dynamics in Africa and in other global south cities. So just to start, as I've said, these world-class cityness, world-class city ideals are becoming more prominent these days, particularly in the context of neoliberal urban development, neoliberal urban governance, as cities are competing for global urban prestige. They are branding themselves as world-class city, looking at, these grand infrastructure projects, cities that are orderly, cities that are, able to attract capital in investment and tourism. So as cities compete for global urban prestige, most of them, try to invest in these mega urban infrastructure projects. And in the context of Africa, there's this mantra, Africa is rising. And as a result, African cities are also caught up in this, dilemma of, trying to brand themselves as world-class city. For instance, Harare has got a vision to become a world-class city by 2025, which is this year. And Johannesburg also has a vision to becoming Africa's world-class city. The same with Lagos, the same with Nairobi, and a number of African cities are also in the scramble to become world-class city. And most of them draw inspiration from the so-called global north or developed country cities, in Europe, in North America. But also from Asian urban contexts. Like I think cities like Singapore, Dubai are also becoming a good examples of some of these world-class city ideals, and a lot of African cities are also looking or drawing inspiration from those cities when it comes to their urban development visions. But then there's this tension between these world-class city aspirations when they are translated into practice in terms of projects, policies, and so forth. And the reality of urban informality, which is a big phenomenon, not just in Africa, but in the global south. For example, in Africa, I think informality is a big issue. Let's say, I think estimates say that over 50% of people live in slums and informal settlements. And over 70% of the people are employed in the informal economy. So that's a big, sector that kind of defines urban development in African cities. So when these visions are juxtaposed with that reality, there are a number of issues that arise that I will share later on using my research in Harare. For some of you that are new to urban geography, human geography, and so forth, I think you may be wondering, what exactly is urban informality? Urban informality is a highly contested concept, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the conceptual debates, its history, and so forth, because that alone would require the whole day to unpack it. But I'm going to share, share with you the basic understanding of it and how I'm operationalizing it in this context. The conventional understanding of urban informality is that these are activities and practices that take place outside urban planning regulations and urban planning frameworks, where people build, let's say people build their own infrastructure, their own housing, and they engage in economic activities such as street trading, waste picking, without licenses, and in contradiction of municipal bylaws. So informality in its basic understanding also is about people creating their own rules by adopting or resisting the prescribed systems of order in urban space. They're challenging the preconceived notion or the propagated notion of urban order or spatial order as conceived by urban planners. So planners and policymakers conceive cities, they want to see cities that are clean, orderly, efficient, and so forth. But people that feel excluded from some of these visions and aspirations, they create their own rules by appropriating space to meet their own needs. And that's where the tension arises from. But in Africa, informality has also been described as an expression of African urban culture and a vernacular way of living. So the fact that informality has become so dominant and prevalent in most African cities is actually a reminder that as planners and policymakers and academics and scholars, we really need to rethink or to reimagine the kind of cities that we want to see. Urban informality might be, it's sending a message that what kind of cities are we building? What kind of, city building processes or city making processes should we ascribe to? So I position my study within this theory of welding, which has been advanced by critical urban scholars like Robinson and Roy and the likes. So when we talk about welding, we are basically looking at how cities aspire to position themselves as global players. It involves the discourses, practices, and aspirations that are mobilized and advanced by urban stakeholders or the urban elites, in this case, the planners, the policymakers, articulating the particular type of urban and global city futures that they want to see. And most of it, as I have said, these are usually Eurocentric, Euro-American ideas and visions of city building that people try to copy and translate into their own context. But there are two dimensions of welding that I want you to pay attention to because they're important when I talk about the results and the implications within the context of Harare. There's what is called welding from above, which is basically how cities' futures are, kind of conceived by the urban elites in a top-down way. Your planners and policymakers, these are a collection of urban elites conceiving and coming up with these visions for using a top-down approach. Then there's also what is called welding from below, which is from the marginalized populations, such as the informal sector, which challenge the dominant and elite-driven ideas and discourses or narratives about urban transformation by actually appropriating cities using their own practices or their own city building approaches. So these two dimensions of welding are not necessarily silos, but they exist in juxtaposition. They contest, they're entangled with one another, as I'll demonstrate later on. So moving on to the context of my study, which is Harare, as I've said, it is the capital city of Zimbabwe in Southern Africa. It was established in 1890 by the British South Africa Company. So it's a post-colonial city. And historically, urban planning instruments, urban planning policies have been used to modernize, to control urbanization, and to suppress local practices that were perceived to be challenging the vision of urban modernity. So the term, originally Harare was called Fort Salisbury, and the term fort comes from fortified cities in medieval Europe, which is basically preventing the urban elites or the well-to-do urban residents from falling into or from being, in quotes, contaminated by the practices of the poor. So the colonial planning system, after independence in 1980, there hasn't been a lot of changes within the, in terms of how planning is practiced, how planning policies and planning strategies are formulated and implemented. For example, the Regional Town and Country Planning Act of 1976, amended in 1996, still resembles the 1940 British Town and Country Planning Act, because if you look at the preamble, basically it's about driving urban modernity. It seeks to preserve order, modernity. All those things are very important. But I think the point I'm making is that we need to reflect what it means in our own context. So this is a planning instrument that was brought in by the colonial government, but the dynamics of urban development within the city have actually changed. The urban economy in Harare has become highly informalized because of structural economic constraints. For a very long time, I think beginning 2000 up to now, the economy of Zimbabwe has not been doing well. And some of those macroeconomic challenges have really contributed to the growth of the informal sector. You see a lot of people practicing street trading, informal settlements, continue to expand within the city. So you can see that there's already tension that we're already seeing. There's a city that has been designed based on modernistic aspirations, and that continues to be planned, governed, and managed using those modernistic aspirations. But there's also another city that is appropriated by marginalized urban populations, by the ordinary citizens, as I'll demonstrate later on in terms of the tension between the different narratives from the people that are on the margins and the urban practitioners themselves. So this is a qualitative study that is based on key informant interviews, 26 urban governance actors, including planners, politicians, municipal administrators, civil society leaders, and then same-structured interviews, 19, with selected street traders. I'm focusing specifically on street traders because that's what my research was focusing on. But informality could also mean people living in informal settlements and people living in slums and so forth. And those, I also reflect on some of those things, what it means when it comes to this tension. So what are the key findings? there are a number of themes that emerged, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on the key ones that I think are important for the sake of this discussion. So the first theme is about positioning Harare in this world-class city debate, in this world-class city scramble. How is Harare? What is the framing? What are the narratives? How do urban practitioners perceive? How do they interpret, conceptualize, and translate some of these ideas? The first thing is, if you look at those two quotations, I'm just going to highlight some of the key points. The first one is from a senior municipal official who said that the goal is to emulate development trajectories of first world cities. He was very clear about that. When I asked him, what exactly does a world-class city mean to you as a practitioner, but also as a city in general? It's about, drawing inspiration from world-class cities. He gave examples of New York and London, and, that we want Harare to reach to that level, where advanced infrastructure, seamless service delivery, and cutting-edge urban management practices define the urban experience. So this is a very powerful reflection from a practitioner. And they are very clear in terms of what kind of city do they want to see when we talk about a world-class city. And then the second one is also from a city planner who said that the vision initially set for 2025, it emphasizes sustainability, smart urban systems, reduced pollution, and the adoption of best practices from developed cities. We continue to pursue a cleaner, less congested Harare with an integrated urban system. So you can see those two quotations, they are kind of related, they kind of reflect similar dynamics in terms of how some of the urban practitioners conceptualize what a world-class city means. There's a lot of emphasis on copying what is happening in first world countries. But then the key question is that if we look at this conceptualization of a world-class city, then you place it within the context of Harare on the ground in terms of what is already happening when it comes to informality and everyday urban practices. We begin to see this tension coming up. As I will demonstrate later on when I reflect on some of the things from the margins. But Harare exists in a duality. There's a coexistence of world-class city and everyday informality. As I've said, when we talk about welding from above and welding from below, they're not necessarily distinct or separate. They are, contested and negotiated in everyday urban life. And that is the situation in Harare. You can see on those pictures. That is the same city, but it shows you the difference between the desired, the dynamics between the desired city and the actually existing city, right? The city that you see there, a sunshine city and, a city that is very beautiful. But then when you go on the ground, you begin to see another city. So that is where my title is coming, a double-faced Harare. You have a tale of two cities that are coexisting, that are entangled, and that, always in contestation with each other based on the different dynamics. So the scholars like what the late Vanessa Watson talk about conflicting rationalities and the tension between the desired and the actual. When we talk about conflicting rationalities in the context of planning, we are saying urban practitioners understand, interpret cities in ways that align with their own logics. But when some of those logics, aspirations, visions are translated into policies and practices and strategies, they, contest with what is on the ground. One of the urban governance consultants that I spoke to talks about, as planners and authorities, we must abandon the view that modern cities, especially in the global south, cannot include informality. These elements can coexist and are not necessarily incompatible. So this is someone who was actually saying that, when we talk about modern cities, when we talk about world-class cities, we need to really think about the meaning of some of these buzzwords in our own urban planning context, in our own urban context, taking into account the local social, economic, political, and spatial characteristics. So you can see on those images, the dualities that I'm talking about. So from the perspectives of the city planners, order, control, and aesthetic conformity is actually, they're actually key parameters that must be respected for a world-class city to be achieved. So in this context, informal economic actors such as street traders and other social groups, they are discursively branded as pathological and disruptive nuisances that must be eliminated for Harare to achieve its world-class city status. So the idea, it has become so entrenched in the minds of urban practitioners in terms of their perspectives, in terms of their practices. They always want to make sure that informality is eradicated, informality is eliminated, because they see it as a disruptive nuisance, as an obstacle to the modernization of the city. But the reality is that Harare as a city, it barely meets the conventional markers, the conventional benchmarks, the conventional parameters of a world-class city as conventionally understood. For a long time, the city has been struggling to invest in, so-called world-class infrastructure. They are not really major or mega urban projects like what is happening in other cities because of the macroeconomic challenges. The city is also struggling with this, critical infrastructure crisis that, undermine some of these visions as they wanted to see. But that has not really stopped urban practitioners from pursuing this dream. It has become so embedded in their discourses, in their everyday practice, that we have to achieve that no matter what. So now that we're in 2025, we'll see what kind of vision would they come up with, because this vision was formulated in 2012 as part of their 2012 to 2025 city strategic plan. So we are monitoring to see what will happen, what kind of vision would they come up with. Would there be vision world-class city or vision 2025 version 2? I don't know. We'll see what will happen. And last year, myself and my former PhD supervisor, we published a paper in Cities where we are looking at the discursive construction of urban space and street trading. And some of the things we present in this paper really align with this discussion. So we wanted to understand how street traders are, perceived in institutional and media discourses. And it has become so clear that, as I've said, urban practitioners discursively brand informality as a nuisance, undermining urban order and undermining the free movement of people and creating an environment that works against the attraction of investment and tourism, as a public health crisis, as a breeding ground for criminality, and so forth. And some of this discursive framing of informality is what has been used to actually advance this world-class city agenda from the city itself. But the key question that we then need to ask is, when we look at the dual reality of Harare, and then we look at the world in Harare from above, and what is happening on the ground, we need to ask ourselves, whose interest and whose vision for Harare? That's an important question. So if you are building a city that does not speak to the everyday reality of your citizens or your residents, what exactly are you building the city for? So the issue of competing visions, competing interests, and power dynamics. And one of the urban scholars I interviewed says, we claim to pursue a world-class city, but this vision is designed to shape how foreigners visitors and the elite perceive Harare not to serve its own residents. In this sense, world-class city is less about improving local livelihoods and more about being a marketing tool for external validation. This is an important quotation because it actually shows that envisioning the city or envisioning Harare, the ordinary residents are rarely given an opportunity to come to the table and contribute their ideas in terms of what kind of city do they want. And when I was asking some of them, like the street traders, ordinary people, although some understand, the city's vision in terms of where the city wants to go, but they were very clear that, they were never part and parcel of this process. They were never consulted in terms of, what exactly do they want Harare to be. So a city that does not speak to the interest, aspirations of its own residents is actually doomed, and that may create challenges when it comes to achieving some of those aspirations. So we have grand urban visions that are imposed on our own cities by pushing the locals out so that we can satisfy, embrace, and meet the needs of someone coming from outside. So what I get from the discussions I had with some of the urban practitioners is that their concern or their interest is really, kind of marketing Harare so that it appeals to the external world, but without really thinking about how does the city embrace the heterogeneity of its residents, the needs, the aspirations of an ordinary woman on the street in terms of, what kind of city do they want to see. And I think one of the street traders said, if they want a world-class city, why cannot that include people who work hard every day to survive? So this actually demonstrate that people on the streets have got their own understanding of a world-class city. They appreciate a world-class city. They are not against the world-class city, but their own concern is, what exactly does it mean for me as an ordinary person who's selling tomatoes in the streets of Harare, who is picking waste in the street of Harare, and who is working in an informal transport sector, for instance. So what are the key takeaways from all this? I think the first point I want to emphasize is that the vision of Harare and indeed most cities in the global south and in Africa, they are kind of designed as top-down standardized packages that are detached from local realities, that do not factor in the complexity of the informal sector, which has become so dominant in most of our cities. These, cities like Harare and like aspire to, as I've said, they emulate what is happening in the global north without thinking about the implications in their own backyard. But these modernistic visions are always entangled and contested by everyday activities and practices of ordinary people. And in that process, groups such as street traders and other informal economic actors, they disrupt these global norms of world-class cities as conventionally understood. But that is where I was saying the wielding of Harare from below is always contested. The wielding of Harare from above is always contested. People are appropriating the city based on their own understanding, based on their own interpretations. And what then happens is you end up having multiple modernities that are coexisting. What other scholars have called multiple modernities. And we cannot simply discard some of these multiple modernities and then try to pursue this unidirectional vision of world-class city. And one of the key questions that, one of the interesting questions that was asked by one of the participants is that, well, what exactly, we need to ask what exactly is a world-class city in our own context? What does a world-class city in Africa mean? What does a world-class city in Harare means? And so the other important point is that when you look at modernity and world-class cities, it is not really a singular trajectory, but it is a contested and negotiated process. It is not like you're just moving from point A to point B. You want to be a world-class city. Then from 2012, and then you smoothly, in a linear process, you achieve that. No, it's always contested and negotiated. So as scholars and practitioners, we need to rethink urban planning and city visioning in the context of these conflicting rationalities. What exactly do we want to see our cities be? And the other thing is that when we look at these world-class city aspirations, I call it a form of epistemic coloniality, which is basically undermining other forms of making cities, right? There's a lot of literature and debate in post-colonial urban theory, looking really about trying to understand what exactly should global South cities be? What exactly should African cities be based on what is happening? Because if you look at the global North cities and the global South cities, you see that there's a very clear distinction in terms of their trajectory of development, in terms of the social, economic, and political characteristics. The context is completely different. And then there have been a lot of really academic scholarship from critical urbanists looking at, what kind of cities do we want? And the push from these, some of these post-colonial scholars is really we need to think about urban theory and practice based on the existing realities in the South. And the other point I want to emphasize is that a truly world-class city should be one that embraces complexities. It should be one that values the informal economies and prioritize the well-being of its inhabitants. Because at the end of the day, we might end up promoting and building cities that appeal to the outside world. What other scholars have called urban fantasies that are associated with dreams and nightmares. So by way of concluding, Harare's world-class city aspirations always clash and collide with everyday informality. And this is not just an issue in Harare alone. If you go to Lagos, you find the same thing in Johannesburg, where the city aspires to become a world-class city. But again, cities like Johannesburg are struggling with inequality. The same thing with Lagos and other, most of these African cities. The issue of inequality, the issue of rising informality, increasing urban poverty, those are some of the realities that coexist with these world-class city aspirations. So when cities build mega infrastructure projects, what happens is you find people being displaced to pave way for some of these things. Ordinary residents' livelihoods being undermined and suppressed and eradicated so that, cities could achieve a world-class city status by any means. But even in cities that are not really doing anything towards the world-class city like Harare, that are struggling with investing in some of these mega infrastructure projects, in terms of the discourses, the policy, the narratives, they are still embedded in these world-class city ideas. But these hegemonic discourses of city making, they take precedence even in the absence of tangible interventions to achieve such visions, as I've said in the case of Harare. Informal practices continue to be undermined, but they remain active in challenging the dominant narratives of city making. So we need to rethink city making processes, city making practices, because Informality is here to stay. Informality has become a reality. Informality is omnipresent in the global South cities. And it is something that we need to embrace rather than thinking about how to eliminate it. Because in as much as urban exclusion exists, in as much as cities struggle to create employment for everyone, informality will not disappear. So urban planning needs to embrace multiple modernities that characterize global South cities. And we need to always ask, whose city are we building? Are we building cities for people in London? Are we building cities for people in New York? But we're in Africa. We need to think about that. And one of the interviews I did with an urban practitioner was really very interesting. Like, okay, maybe we need to think about informality as a vernacular way of city making, of city building in our African context, right? How can you take a London and New York and try to translate it or transplant it into the context of Harare without thinking about the economic situation, without thinking about the social dynamics, without thinking about the spatial implications of these processes? Thank you very much for your time. And I think this brings me to the end of my presentation.
Excellent, Doc. Thank you very much for that fascinating presentation. I think it's something that resonates with quite a lot of cities, not only, of course, maybe predominantly in the global South, but I think we are also seeing resonance even across the global North, especially with all these global economic crisis and rising unemployment, and also the proliferation of city trading, and especially street trading. I think there are quite a number of interesting hooks that you highlighted. I particularly was fascinated by, your take on epistemic coloniality, especially with regards to city planning and city bylaws. And I think that's quite an interesting concept to think with, especially looking at how many of these post-colonial African states have adopted, the colonial standards and colonial city bylaws and planning standards that continue to marginalize the everyday forms of livelihoods of many in the global South. So I think let me open this up to our colleagues, and we can then get to engage. I don't know if there are any comments, questions for Dr. Elmont. Yes, I see Obey. So I think, Doc, we can take maybe 3-4 questions, and then I'll allow you to respond, and then we take another round in that order. And then I see Crispin. So Obey, go ahead, and then Crispin.
All right. Thank you so much. Can you hear me, Doc Simba?
Yes, clearly.
Thank you so much for organizing this special talk. It was quite interesting to learn from the work that has been done by Dr. Elmont. So I had a few sort of, I'm not so sure if there are questions, but perhaps points of departure for further conversations. So to start with, thank you again, my brother, Dr. Elmont. This was really eye-opening, very insightful. But then I wanted to make a follow-up. You talked about the realities of competing interests when it comes to sort of modeling the cities that you are living in. And in one of your interviews that you indicated, you said there was someone who complained, or rather one of the street players who complained about the issue of them not being involved. Can you maybe have a follow-up comment on that aspect? Because on one end, we are talking about the idea of trying to avoid epistemic coloniality, which to me, issues of participation and citizen engagement can also be framed along the lines of epistemic coloniality. So how do we strike a balance of wanting to involve citizens as major players or as major stakeholders in the remodeling and modeling of our cities without necessarily falling in the same trap of us perpetuating the colonial practices as I've understood from your presentation. Then I also wanted to sort of still on that point. Could we then also completely say this when the vendors are complaining for not being, or rather raising concerns for not being involved? To what extent should the involvement be, part of the modeling of cities? Because one would perhaps argue that, okay, citizens had the opportunity to vote for the elected officials. Was that not enough involvement? What kind of participation should be part and parcel of the everyday mechanisms of modeling cities? So I think I'll stop there for now. But if there's room further, I can also bring some further thought-provoking issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Obey. Crispin?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Doc, for very, very interesting presentation. Yeah, thought-provoking and yeah, very interesting. So my question centers around maybe conceptually. I just wanted clarity in terms of when we talk about world-class city, or is it world-class city, and the smart cities. Are we talking about the same thing here? In terms of conceptually, and then your very interesting sort of like in a way sort of way of looking at it, maybe in your sort of like the way that you are viewing it more as epistemic sort of coloniality. So, but my question is around. Maybe you need to expand more in terms of maybe what that sort of like in a way entails in terms of, because I'm not getting it very clear. Because my take would be, looking at what is happening, is it epistemic sort of like coloniality, or we are seeing a new sort of like in a way sort of neoliberal sort of like agenda, where neoliberal capitalism, through these sort of like strategies of smart city, world-class city, it's actually it's just purely a way, a model where capitalism is trying to reinvent itself in the face of the crisis that it is facing now. Are we not seeing, is it epistemic sort of like coloniality, or is just capitalism trying to reinvent itself in the face of a crisis of neoliberal capitalism, which it faces currently? So for me, I would characterize it more as a capitalism that is sort of in a crisis of trying to rejuvenate itself, reinvent itself through this sort of like smart city and world-class sort of like new city. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you. Yes, I see. I think we can take two more. I see Rifos and Eddie. And then I think in the next round we'll start with Obakeng. So Okwe and Eddie, go ahead.
Okay. Can I go first?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Elmond, for the wonderful presentation. I've had, like the opportunity to work with him on some projects. So I definitely appreciate, like the passion, like when he's talking about some of these projects. I thoroughly enjoyed the presentation and the point you make about the fact that urban informality has come to stay, and then the fact that we need to acknowledge it well. I want you to provide a quick clarification on what your thoughts may be in terms of how, current research dynamics should be responding to some of these new ways of thinking and conceptualizing the African city, because whilst we have to acknowledge that, urban informality has come to stay, we cannot also discount the fact that cities are also now responding to so many global ideals, and then, new financial flows that are dispossessing new, like old places, and building a new city that would appeal, to global aesthetics. So it's a conflicting situation right now. What would you say should be the new approach in terms of research, epistemology, how we rethink about the city, and how that should shape our thinking in terms of, urban, like researchers in a way that we understand the city, not only in terms of the fact that we need to acknowledge, urban informality, but doing that vis-a-vis the fact that we cannot also do away with the new financial flows and how the cities in Africa are now responding to this new wave of neoliberalism. So, like, just your random thoughts on what we should be doing. Yeah, thank you very much for that, and wonderful presentation.
Yeah, thank you. I think we can take Eddie now and then allow Dr. Elmond to respond. I think it's a bit of a mouthful, but I can see your hands. We are going to take you just after Dr. Elmond responds. So Eddie, go ahead.
All right, thank you. My first question is, considering that you were looking at informality and urbanism as contrasting areas, can we consider informality as a sign of failure? That is the question number one. And then question number two, I note now, in your interaction with players, especially in the informal space, how do they hold their place? How do they see themselves in the space that they are in? Are they happy in there? Or do they wish to be in a different space? So that if we understand this, we can really try to see how this can really think of urbanism from where we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. Yeah, I think Elmond, I think you can have a take on this, and then we take the next round after your response.
Yeah, thanks, Simba. I think these four questions are very brilliant, and they are very thought-provoking, and I think they also help me to think about my own future research. I may not have the answer, like the answer is in straight answer to say, oh, this is what should happen. But let me reflect. The first question, I think Obey had two reflections, which I think are very important. The first one was around the models of citizen participation, what could work in the context of Harare and more generally. I think you are right, because if you look at the number of people that are working in the informal sector, it's so big. And the discussion around participation is that sometimes it can be very expensive to involve everyone. It can cause, it can result in a lot of fatigue and the like. But I think my thinking is that Harare, for instance, has had a number of associations representing the different interests of informal economic actors. What I would like to see, probably maybe, it is happening, but more could be done, is, when some of these urban strategies are being formulated and are being, debated at the level of the city, associations should actually be actively involved. Treated as associations or informal sector organizations should be part and parcel of these urban discussions. And then they can transmit some of these, some of the discussions to their members. Because I think you make a point that people may argue that, people have already, elected representatives, people that will represent them in the context of representative democracy at the city level. But we need to explore alternative ways of engaging. But when we engage and when we create opportunities for participation, I think for me, that could be a way of sort of decolonizing our hegemonic framing of what a seat should be. Because as I've said, people have got different understandings. They've got different framing of what a seat should look like. If you take a planner that has been trained in a Eurocentric way, and then you take an ordinary person, because I think we need to distance ourselves from this idea that people do not understand what planning is. But I can tell you that in the context of slums and informal settlements, for instance, you may be shocked on how people understand how to build a neighborhood. It may not be the same neighborhood as what a city planner would want to see, but at least that understanding of how to organize themselves, how to to mobilize solidarity and try to address some of their challenges is really, we need to tap into that. We need to create platforms where people can actually have a voice. And the question by Crispin, I think it's very important, which talks about the conceptual idea around world-class city versus smart city conceptually. And I think it is important to note that there's kind of an overlap between these different buzzwords. A smart city is usually is largely predominantly technology and the like, but some of the ideas, some of the characteristics of smart cities can actually be infused in the world-class cities. So there is a thin line, there's always overlap in terms of concepts. And then what I refer to as epistemic coloniality, it has to do with, when we talk about epistemic coloniality, it has to do with undermining the traditional indigenous understanding or knowledge of what cities should look like, where this hegemonic framing, the Eurocentric, Euro-American based understanding of urbanism takes precedent. That's epistemic coloniality, where I'm saying we need to demystify, we need to deconstruct that and probably create ways where people could actually, contribute to what the kind of city they want to see based on their lived experience. And I think you are right that we see capitalism and neoliberal capitalism actually reinventing itself. And that's a reality that we are confronted with. But the way we respond to it in an African context, the way we embrace it, we need to think about, how does it play out in our own context, given the socioeconomic and spatial realities that we're facing. And I think Rifos talks about what could be the new ways of doing research in this context. I think you are right that, as researchers, we need, even myself, I'm guilty of sometimes perpetuating some of these hegemonic framings, but we need to think probably more of action, bottom up, data collection processes where we engage deeply with people, ordinary people, and kind of understand the ways they frame cities. In some of our research, we may be shocked. We published a paper this year where we engage people in Accra in terms of their understanding of resilience and sustainability. You may think that people do not understand the concepts that you use in academia, but they do in their own terms. So we need to create some of those platforms. If you say, okay, we want Harare to be like this, what do you think a city should look like? We may be surprised that we can come up with alternative framings of urbanism. And I think the other question that was asked had to do with, can we use informality as a frame of thinking? Of course, yes. There is a lot of work from critical urban scholars, the likes of Roy, who talks about informality as a mode of urbanization, as an urbanization logic. Rather than thinking about informality as something that is negative, we need to think about it as a mode of urbanization. We need to think about it as an organizing logic. It is not a separate sector from formality because they are interrelated. They are it is part and parcel of the structural dynamics of city building. So Simba, let's take the other round of questions.
Okay, thanks, Elmond, for that. So I think let's start with Obakeng, and then after that, Sandra, and then Divine, then Godfrey. That will be our second round. I think there are some, Elmond, probably you can check some in the comment section and maybe write the ones that you want to reflect on, and then while the other ones are asking their questions. So Obakeng, Sandra, Divine, and Godfrey in that order.
No, thank you very much, Doc. Thanks for the presentation, Dr. Elmond. I just want to reflect really on the presentation. I think what really caught my attention was the takeaway from the presentation. There's a point that says that a truly world-class city should be one that embraces its complexities, values informal economies, and provide, if I'm not mistaken, or promote the well-being of all its inhabitants. What really comes out glaringly there is the informal economies, which are a characteristic of urban informality. But before even I get into that, I just want to briefly reflect on colonialism, how it shaped our urban spaces. Colonialism, for instance, a city like Kimberley and other cities in South Africa, they were designed specifically to cater to the metropole, to the European metropole. So the colonies like Kimberley and other cities in Africa or the global South, they were just feeders to the European metropoles and the Americas. So they were not designed for anything other than for a particular class. And this class, it's the dominant class that often find itself in Europe and find itself in the West predominantly. So, and I find it very interesting when you mention that a world-class city should embraces things like informal economies. But now, right there, instead of problematizing urban informality or advocating for the elimination, eradication of urban informality, we're saying that we should embrace it or value it. But then this at the same time, it encourages exploitation, and perpetual insulting of the have-nots, the other class, which is us, the proletariats, the working class, who are in the ghettos, who are in informal settlements, who are displaced. So basically, the takeaway from this presentation says that we should perpetuate the exploitation of people in informal communities, economies. And that is very problematic from where I'm standing, because I think how we should plan a city, we should be clear and very open about it. My thinking is that a city should be an African socialist city, because what it will deal with this antagonistic or antagonizing classes in society. So what we won't be doing, we won't be planning on the basis or on the interest of Bretton Woods institutions that are based at the World Bank, that are based in IMF, because our cities now, they are planning an urban development is wholly informed by Bretton Woods institutions. Because, for instance, you look at Gautrain, you look at Rea Vaya in Johannesburg, you look at all these mass transit systems that are in Africa. They are financed and promoted by Bretton Woods institutions. They are not really for us. They are encouraging an exacerbation of this inequality that we have in our cities and continuation of exploitation of the other class. So I think a city should be an African socialist city. That's it. I think it will address a whole lot of systematic and other issues that we find in urban development and planning of our communities or cities. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Obakeng. Sandra, and then Divine.
Thank you very much, Simba, and thank you, Dr. Bandauko, for the presentation. I think my issues that I'm going to raise are probably also linked to some of the issues that have been raised earlier on. The first one, it could be probably of my misreading of the presentation, or I got lost somewhere along the way, but I noted some sort of homogenizing arguments and statements and a lack of more political analysis. For instance, we are just referring to street traders. Who are these street traders or these street vendors? did we engage with them, intersectionally in terms of their different and multiple identities to see how they are shaping and reshaping, Harare as a political space and also as an economic space. And I also do not really, agree with the sort of, dichotomization that I think Doc probably did, without knowing, probably in his analysis. It's like we have on one side people who are, anti-informality, and then on the other side with people who support, informality. And from the course that he gave us, it seems, the governance experts that he talked to probably, yes, they are anti-colonial, they want to change things, but there's this sort of, lack of analysis beyond that to say that within this context, there are people, who are also supporting this informality, supposedly not with good intentions, because they have political agendas. So cities, at any particular, historical point in time, they become hijacked for some, whatever reasons, whether we want to, forward our political agendas. When it's good, ZANU-PF will give people land in spaces that are not supposed to be occupied, and they become informal settlements. But when they don't like that and they are leaning towards a neoliberal, I don't know, agenda that Prof, I think it was Maringira who talked about, neoliberalism, they lean towards that and these are demolished. So if you're not going to do an actor analysis to see who are all these actors in this governance space, we are probably going to come up with, conclusions that will not give us answers to respond to this problem. Because at the end of the day, we want, social justice within the city. We want development. However, we term it, whether it's in terms of infrastructure, it's housing, it's water, it's sanitation. And then the other one is around issues of gender. I'm not talking about gender in terms of men, women, but gender in terms of intersectional sense. The different identities within the cities. I think it's linked to my, earlier point where I'm saying how are these, street vendors shaping and reshaping, or even perhaps reproducing, some of the negativity and negative aspects that we also don't even want to see. We have gangs on the streets. We have people doing drugs. How are all these issues entangled, in terms of politics, in terms of our economics, in terms of different government policies, who is managing the city at that particular moment, how is central government intervening in, local governance issues. So I think if we take that approach, we'll also be able to link that to issues of citizenship, for instance. If you go to downtown Harare, there are Pakistans, there are Somalis, how are they also fitting in this particular context, and how do we take this into consideration when we want to move forward? Of course, noticing that we cannot have, a clear answer. Thank you, Simba.
Thanks, Sandra, for your questions. Divine, and then Godfrey. Then we'll allow Elmond to respond.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Elmond. And this is really a fantastic presentation, and a lot resonates with the case of Accra, which is my research field. So thanks so much for that. A lot of studies have shown, we can talk about Hemando, Roy, Simon, talking about informality not being an anomaly, neither is it a mere byproduct of urban processes, but we both understand that they constitute an integral part of the urban economy. But it appears that in the presentation, the urban elites and city authorities were blaming informality as one of the major hurdles to achieving this whole world-class city status. But I have two questions here. The first one is, I'm just curious, are there any other underlying factors that is kind of stifling the whole idea of achieving this world-class status? And then my second question has to do with your thought about this whole urban process, urbanization, and its associated issues. Do you think we are jumping the gun when it comes to this whole idea of attaining the global South cities attaining world-class cities. Because these world-class cities that we are looking up to, London, New York, and so on and so forth, they started with a process. They had blueprints. They started with urban managerialism, which was an era within that process of attaining the world-class city. They also got to a point where they introduced what they call entrepreneurial urban regime, which kind of created that sort of investment within the city before attaining world-class cities. But it appears that cities in the global south, including Harare, just gets up from its current status and wants to attain world-class cities without going through some of these processes. Obviously, we don't necessarily have to copy the blueprint of world-class cities, but I'm just trying to say is that these cities that we are trying to look up to started from somewhere. They followed some sort of processes that kind of built them up to becoming world-class cities. Do you think we are just jumping the gun as cities in the global south? Thank you.
Thank you, Divine. I think we can take Godfrey and then Elmont, you can respond.
I think Godfrey is the one who just spoke, right?
No, that's Divine.
No, Divine.
Oh, okay, good.
Godfrey, are you there?
Okay. Yes, thank you very much for the presentation, Dr. Elmont. So I just wanted to find out in terms of conceptualization of informality, both theory and practice. My question is, informality to what? Does it speak to, because if we take a case study of Zimbabwe, particularly in Harare, what is happening, sometimes what we perceive as informality is actually formal economy. So the question is, informality to what? So thank you.
Thank you.
But let me just quickly respond.
Yes. I think you can.
I think there were questions from Obakeng, which talks about coloniality and the othering of informality, and the idea of the African social city. I think I agree with that perspective. And just for clarity, I never said we should perpetuate the victimization of informality. I think I said we need to rethink our planning models in the context of informality and see how we can embrace it. So embracing it does not necessarily mean, displacement or eviction, but we need to think about how can we accommodate it in a way that still preserves its organic strategy. I think the questions from Sandra are very critical. And because this was just a short presentation, I couldn't present everything within 30-40 minutes. Actually, this is actually a full paper that is under review in cities. And some of the things I really pinned them out. The idea of avoiding dichotomization, yes, I agree. And in my analysis, I really I really unpack some of these ideas, because even within the city of Harare itself, there are some officials that are very clear in terms of them questioning the very same idea of a world-class city, in terms of what it means, in terms of how the plan itself was conceived, in terms of the implications for ordinary people. And I agree with you, the issues of who are these street traders. And as I've said, this is part of a large-scale project. And one of the papers I published in Gender, Place and Culture of this really looks at gender and intersectional perspectives in terms of appropriating urban space. So all these things about intersectional, who are the actors, what are their different identities, and how do they contribute to city building or city making, I really address them in some of my papers. And I agree with you that, and one of the things that actually at the center of my large scale project is really demystifying this idea that informality or street traders are homogeneous groups, because they are not. They are heterogeneous in terms of gender, in terms of experience, in terms of the type of goods they sell, and the like. And we need to really factor some of those things, and there are implications for urban space. And I think the question from Define, the questions from Define are really very critical. There was what are some of the underlying factors beside the issues of informality? I think for a very long time, Harare has been struggling as a city to attract global capital because of the macroeconomic challenges that the city is facing. Within this broader macroeconomic fundamentals, the country has not been doing well. And that has really affected the city's capacity to invest in large-scale infrastructure projects and in quotes, modernize its urban built environment. The issues around even informality in its different sense, not just street trading, but in its different dimensions. The politics of the city and the issues around, governance and the political economy have really been very, very instrumental in actually creating a barrier for the city to move towards what it wanted to do. And the question about jumping the gun, I think that's a very good point. That's where I was saying we may need to sit down and go back to the drawing board and ask ourselves very critical questions like, what kind of cities do we want to see in Africa? What exactly is an African city? I think that's a question. One of the city officials I talked to raised that question. We need to think about what exactly is an African city. What kind of city do we need to see in Africa? So if you are jumping the gun, as you said, and then to say we want to come up with London or New York in Harare, but how did London get to where it is? How did Harare get to where it is, and how do we move forward? And when you look at this colonialism, I think it's very important because most of these post-colonial cities, they are really struggling to get out of this colonial nostalgia and think about, how do we move forward 3-4 decades after independence and build a city that, because when the British came to Harare, they had the city that they wanted to see. They wanted to build a Europe in Harare. But can we still continue to dream to build a Europe 40 years after independence? So these are some of the things that we need to think. Perhaps the idea of the African social city that the other colleague talked about could be, what exactly does it mean? How does it look like? And so forth. Then the question from Godfrey is that informality to what and informality for whom? Informality is like I said, the debate is so convoluted. It's a loaded concept. Sometimes people struggle to unpack it or to operationalize it. But even when you look at within this discussion, there's informality. What people have called informality from below, which is the one that is practiced by marginalized populations of the ordinary citizens. Then there's also informality from above. Scholars like Roy talks about the state being an informalized entity in itself, because it is the one that decides who is informal and who is not formal. And informality, not being a separate sector, but being a site of critical analysis, the political economic perspective, we need to think about how do these things, they become entangled, they are contested, they relate to each other. Informality sometimes support the formal sector. In the context of Harare, for instance, I think I in one of my papers, I actually, reflect on how the informal sector is actually subsidizing the formal sector. So it's a very complex dynamic that we need to think about, and something that is not easy, but something that we need to keep asking ourselves, keep reflecting, in the context of African cities. So I think that's what I would say. All these are very brilliant questions, very brilliant reflections, and thank you very much for your engagement.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Elmont. I think maybe you've touched on quite a number of other issues that were asked. I think Betha had posted a comment around whose city are we building? Maybe something that you might want to reflect on. maybe briefly, and I think Taru also, Josiah had some few comments and questions, I think some of which you have responded to. Is city making a moving target, especially with regards to how maybe this could be a very elusive for the global south? I think that's one issue that he was raising there. And do we see a unified world making from above as presented by the bureaucrats or the city planners, those that are maybe referred to maybe as the colonial mind, based maybe on their training? And I think he also raised an important questions on the central and local government in terms of their visions for the city. Is it something that can be maybe seen as a static, and how does the local politics color this aspiration of world making, and especially the world-class city and cities? So I think some of the issues you have responded to in your response. And maybe as the chair, I would abuse my position to throw the last one. And I think there are very interesting observations, as someone who's also very much interested in informality. In many of these cities that you find, sometimes there are enclaves within those particular cities that you can think that maybe there are actually multiple cities within a city. And I think Thabo Mbeki made a very interesting analogy to this, where he was saying maybe you could think of South Africa as two nations in one. But at the same time, we can also think of some of these cities as multiple cities in one, where if you go to Borodale, for instance, the kind of infrastructure, the kind of space that you see there is fundamentally different to what you see when you go downtown, when you go to Mbare. I think the same can be said with Cape Town and indeed many other cities. When you go to Kaeli Chalanga and then you go to Camps Bay, you go to Constantia, you think of the coexistence of enclaves that are within that particular city, and maybe that's how that speaks to some of the examples that you have seen. I know you've worked on a number of cities in Africa, and I think the last one, I just wanted to, you raised something I think that is very interesting on how the local people, we sort of impose quite a lot, me included, sometimes borrow colonial concepts and analytical and conceptual frameworks when we are analyzing the everyday life of these people. But you said something very interesting, that we actually think that maybe they don't know what we are talking about when we talk about resilience or other concepts that we use. So I was interested in some of the local concepts that are developed by these very same people that we are trying to understand. Can we use these concepts of their own making as our own analytical and conceptual tools, and how productive are they? Because in most cases, when people are talking about city making, informality, people tend to think of Henry Lefebvre, David Harvey, and many others that are mentioned as our analytical lens, and we reproduce this coloniality even in terms of knowledge production about city making. So do we see any currents in some of these local terms and concepts? Kungwava, for instance, I'm just using this kind of examples in our analytical lens. Thanks, Elmond.
Yeah, Simba, that's a very powerful reflection, and me included. I'm also a culprit on reproducing this coloniality, and it's sometimes we do it because we want to get our papers published, because of the nature of the academy, like how the knowledge production ecosystem is structured. If we don't, let's say you are writing a paper on the right to the city, obviously you'll be forced you have to cite Lefebvre, you have to engage with the works of Harvey, and some reviewers or even editors who actually push you to engage with that, and unfortunately that's the nature of the knowledge production system. And I as I've said, when we did a study in Accra, in the informal settlements there, and asking people what exactly do they understand when it comes to urban resilience and sustainability, you'll be surprised how they were so clear. And some of their framing and understanding really unsettles the dominant conceptual frameworks. And we were able to really engage and then challenge some of these conventional, and we were successful in the paper got published. And I think we need to do more in terms of really thinking about how do we advance and amplify these traditional codes, indigenous understanding or knowledge, that sometimes we make assumptions. And when we go and engage the people, you'll be shocked. I think this happens a lot. People nowadays engage more in action research, where they do participatory research approaches and so forth, as a way of decolonizing this knowledge production system. We need to do more of that. We need to kind of, distance ourselves from this whole these people do not understand, so we have to go there with our own understanding and the like. So it's not an easy process. It's something that is really challenging, but I think we need to do more in terms of reflecting on our own way of doing research and the like. I don't have the answer to everything, but I think my question is we need really to engage with people on the ground, people that live and work at the margins of our cities, and we'll be surprised how much they can actually contribute in terms of our city building ideas and the like. So that's what I would say. I think this is a challenge, I think, for me and others who are working in urban spaces, to really question our approaches, to question the way we engage with people, the way we engage with concepts. So thank you so much for this very fruitful discussion. And I think
yeah, thanks, Elmont. Yes, I know we are way above and over time, but there's one of my students who's just posted something. I think it's very important. I really appreciate it when some of my students engage. And she's saying, in your course of research, what forms of organization or resistance or everyday innovation have emerged that you believe are under-recognized in the mainstream urban policy? Resistance in the form of secret networks, creating informal unions, or even negotiating behind the scenes with politicians. I think this is fascinating, a very fascinating contribution there. I don't know if you can reflect. Maybe that's the last one, Elmont.
Yeah, that's perfect, and I think I like the way the student has framed it, and in one of my papers published this year, looks at everyday resistance to urban exclusion, like engaging with street traders to understand how they resist exclusionary practices from the city. And I came up with a lot of different concepts and different strategies that they use to negotiate access to urban space, because they operate in a hostile environment where they are not supposed to be there, because planners always say they pollute the city and the like, but they devise different strategies. I developed a concept of what is called subaltern surveillance, where they study how the city does its enforcement and adjust their operations based on that. And I'm in the process of actually developing it into a full concept, like in terms of the different dynamics. Sometimes they also collude with the enforcement officials within the city, creating an informal network so that they get informed when something is going to happen, when there are evictions that are coming up. Sometimes they also, the issue of bribery and the like, really very, 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 very common in terms of trying to lay claims to urban space. But forming associations is also another strategy which they have resorted to, where there's a representative organization. But the strategy of organization or organizing or collective mobilizing is really a challenge because of the contagious nature of urban politics in our context in Harare. Associations exist, but there's political fragmentation that really affect their effectiveness when it comes to advocacy and pushing the rights of the street traders and so forth. So I appreciate that question a lot. And there, I think in some of my work, I really engage with everyday resistance and negotiation as part of one of the key pillars of the research that I've conducted.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Lerato, and thanks a lot, Elmont. Yeah, let me take this opportunity to really appreciate your making time to share your interesting work with us, and I'm sure we really benefited. You could see from the engagements, and I know there are quite a lot of other people that would have loved to ask questions, but I think because of time and other commitments, they couldn't do that. So thank you very much for allowing us to engage your work, and we'll definitely call upon you as well later for other presentations whenever you are available, and we really appreciate your input and learning from your work. And I also want to thank everyone who has joined us today. We do this weekly, and we would really appreciate if you can also join us next week. We are building on this kind of work to think about decoloniality and decolonizing knowledge production, and more particularly sociology. So it's a very good foundation that you have laid there, Elmont, with your analytical lenses, around how we can think of this epistemically, maybe as some form of epistemic coloniality, epistemic resistance, and stuff like that. So thank you very much, everyone, for staying up to the end, and do enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks a lot, Elmont.
Thank you for the invitation, Simba, and thanks everyone for attending and wonderful discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. And we hope you are going to join us next week. We have another interesting presentation on decolonizing sociology and the history of sociology. So I think some of you might be interested in that presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us, Prof. Appreciate.
Simba?
Yes, yes, John, how are you?
I'm good. I was asking, do you have an email list where you send the invitation for this?
I would really appreciate if you can share. I do have some, but it's quite limited. So I would really appreciate if you can share your emails, and would regularly send invitations.
Okay. So I can just type it in
the chat. Yes. I'll be able to capture that, and then I'll add to the mailing list.
Okay. Because I only got to see this from some other social groups.
Okay. Yeah, I will try to share as wide as possible. But I think we can create a very big mailing list, which I think is important.
That's okay. Let me send you
your email. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Was he not there? So I'm not sure.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much. I've received it. I'll add this to the mailing list.
The J is small letter there.
Oh, okay. The first one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, have a good day.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everyone.